Welcome to this new presentation on voyage planning in a changing world. The main purpose of this presentation is to show that with good planning and preparation, it is still possible to plan, undertake, and safely complete a long voyage or a passage, even in these changing times. All the essential factors that need to be taken into account to achieve such an aim are outlined in this four-part presentation. So let's go back to the subject itself, voyage planning. Well, the main objective of voyage planning is to plan an offshore voyage or an ocean passage that takes best advantage of prevailing winds and favorable seasons. Essentially, to always be in the right place at the right time, or better still, not to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I highlighted the not to be in red because recently I gave an interview to Yachting World magazine, the oldest sailing magazine in the world, and I was asked by the editor to outline my rules for offshore sailing and the fact that I haven't had any major problems during all these last 50 years of roaming the oceans of the world. And I thought only a little bit, and I said, actually, I don't have to-do rules, but I certainly have a lot of not-to-do rules. And this is one of them, not to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, but what is voyage planning really? Well, voyage planning is common sense. In the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, this is how it is described. And then we come to the next question, what is common sense? And I've done quite a lot of research online and so on to see what is really common sense. And it is something that maybe should be called uncommon sense because we know a lot of people who don't seem to have it. Anyway, let's hope that everyone listening now does have a serious dose of common sense. And what is it? Well, it is the basic level of practical knowledge and judgment that we all need to help us live in a reasonable and safe way. And I will change that live and say for us to sail in a reasonable and safe way. Well, I must have had some common sense myself because I've sailed for nearly 50 years and over 200,000 miles on my 5 separate aventuras, and I never had any really serious or maybe life-threatening situation. And obviously, I might have been, as I said earlier, had some dose of common sense. But let's first look at the boats that I sailed on. First of all, the Aventura 1, I sailed with Doina, Ivan, and Gwenda for over 6 years. It was an 11-meter, 36-foot Trintella 3, and it covered 58,000 miles, and it was a wonderful boat to have into a kind of voyage that we undertook there with our 2 young children. Doina at the beginning was 7 and Ivan was 5. And 6 years later, when we came back, they integrated very well into the British educational system. And it was a highlight of our lives, that very first voyage of Aventura 1. That was followed a few years later by Aventura 2, slightly larger, 40 foot, 12 meters, with which I covered about 40,000 miles and also took part in the very first round the world rally, which I organized. Then followed Aventura 3, which was probably my most adventuresome boat that I had because it sailed 70,000 miles over a period of 13 years. It was 13 meters, 43 foot long, and it took me to Antarctica. Then Aventura 4 was more or less a development of the aluminium boat concept, also a French boat. The OVNI was built, the OVNI 43, Aventura 3, and I had the Aventura 4. And this was built by the French boat yacht Garcia. Exploration 45 is the model, and it's my concept of a boat to sail in any seas, in any oceans, and in any seasons. It is very successful. Actually, this very year, 3 Exploration 45 went through the Northwest Passage, and my previous Aventura 4 sailed to Antarctica. And finally, is Aventura 0. I switched from monohulls to multi-hulls. This was a performance catamaran built by Outremer, also a French boat yard in the south of France. And my plan was to sail around the world with a fully electric boat. This boat is fully electric that you see on the screen. And unfortunately, the COVID pandemic in 2020, when we started the voyage, didn't allow us to finish and complete the circumnavigation, so I had to abandon it because the idea was to sail around the world on the route sailed by Magellan 500 years previously between 1519 and 1522, and to return to Spain to the point where he started off from to Seville in 2022. Well, unfortunately, because of COVID, it didn't happen. So going back now to planning a voyage in these changing times, it's very important to highlight now the essential situation that we should know. Already what is known is the world weather systems. We have here, for example, a display of the 4 quarters of the year for all oceans of the world, and you can see the intertropical convergence zone, the areas of the prevailing winds, the highs in the high latitudes, and so on. So that is what we know. And indeed, Joshua Slocum was the first who stressed the fact how important it is to know that you know the laws that govern the winds, and to know that you know them, because this will give you an easy mind on your voyage. Otherwise, you may tremble at the appearance of every cloud. And Joshua Slocum was the first man to have sailed around the world on a small boat, and obviously what he said then, it is still very valid even today. So something else we know the global currents of the entire world, and they have not changed very much, although there will be one change, which I'm going to highlight very soon, and that is something is happening to the Gulf Stream. So what is also known is the most essential and the most important factor in planning a voyage, and that are the areas and seasons of tropical storms. So as you see on this map, you can see in every ocean the period of the tropical storms. For example, on the right-hand side, you have the North Atlantic, there from June to November, and the approximate area which is critical and should be avoided. Well, we could come to your help when avoiding areas like these, because the latest edition of Cornell's Ocean Atlas, which I developed with my son Ivan, shows precisely the areas affected by tropical storms based on the records of tropical storms of the last 12 years. The data for the Atlas covers 25 years of observations, satellite observations, but in this case, we're only talking about the areas covered and which are under threat of tropical storms. And this is the page for the North Atlantic Ocean for June. Similarly, if you go now to the North Pacific, the northeastern part of the Pacific in the month of May, you see the critical area of the coast of Central America, Mexico, and parts of Southern California. And on the western side are the typhoons from China northwards to Japan and south east to the Philippines. And what is very interesting, pointing on to this page, is that the tropical storm seasons in the northeastern North Pacific was until recently regarded as lasting from June to November. And as you can see now on this chart, there are now tropical storms, hurricanes, also in the month of May. So that area should be avoided during the month of May. So that is all known. But what should be also known? Well, I give the word here now to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who in its latest assessment on the impact of climate change warns that climate change is causing dangerous disruptions in nature. And in fact, I must digress here a bit by saying that the real purpose of this presentation is to highlight these risks that have an impact and consequences on planning a longer voyage. And the list that you can see now is indeed very comprehensive. This is what's happening in nature now. The oceans are getting warmer. The Arctic ice cap is melting at a faster rate than in any recorded time. The ice shelf surrounding Antarctica is diminishing at an unprecedented rate. The Gulf Stream is slowing down. The tropical storm seasons are less clearly defined and are becoming more active. Extra-seasonal tropical storms are more common. And finally, even the trade winds are becoming less consistent. So the oceans are getting warmer. And this is a very good example. This happened last year where Hurricane Lee, that formed west of the Cape Verde Islands and passed close to the Eastern Caribbean and then turned north towards the US East Coast all the way to Nova Scotia. And what is quite amazing is something that you can see on this satellite picture prepared by NASA, where you can see both the temperatures. And I'll give them to you in both centigrade, Celsius, and in Fahrenheit. Because if you look at the east, on the left-hand side, on the western side, you can see some very dark colored red, almost brown, and that is a temperature of 32 degrees. That is tremendously high, and that is what generates tropical storms. I want to stress first that I used to sail in that area, and I remember being up off the coast of Maine in the United States with the first Aventura, and our anchor got fouled by, I believe it was a lobster pot, and without thinking, it was summer, it was August, I jumped in the water, and I nearly had a heart attack. The water was only 10 degrees Celsius, very, very cold. And you can imagine when I look myself at this chart, and you can see there that the same waters were between 30 and 32 degrees. And I want to make a very important point here. By comparison, during our first round-the-world voyage on the first Aventura, the warmest water we came across was in the Red Sea, and the maximum we recorded then was 25 degrees. Whereas tropical storms, but the hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons, they only built up their energy if the water is at least 28 degrees. So this is why this is something that's well worth bearing in mind. So I want to describe it more, what's happening at this very moment. So the warmer ocean temperatures and the higher sea levels are expected to magnify their impact and intensity. So these conditions have resulted in the global climate having much more heat energy in it. This means that more extreme weather events in the form of stronger hurricanes, hotter heat waves, and more devastating droughts, wildfires, and floods. The global climate has thus reached a state of instability that is caused by more available heat having to find ways to redirect this added energy. Recent extreme events are the direct consequence of the global climate seeking to reach a new equilibrium. And here I want to make it very simple. What it means that there is a lot more heat in the atmosphere and it has nowhere to go. This is what's happening in the last few years, and this is why we have stronger hurricanes, stronger cyclones, and stronger typhoons. Another example, in recent years, cyclones have not only increased in intensity, but are also affecting areas outside the tropics, whether in the Arctic, Canada, or subtropical South Pacific. For example, in September 22, Hurricane Fiona was the most powerful and destructive storm to hit Canada on record. Canada, not the Eastern Caribbean or Florida or North Carolina. So having developed off the West African coast, it moved west, passing over the Eastern Caribbean. It continued in the northerly direction, parallel to the US East Coast, as the most intense Category 4 hurricane to reach such a northerly latitude. It maintained its energy by passing over very warm waters, as described earlier, with surface temperatures of 28 to 30 degrees Celsius, 84 to 86 Fahrenheit. While still maintaining hurricane force winds, it made landfall in Nova Scotia and eventually dissipated west of Greenland, which is unheard of to have a hurricane reaching as far north as Greenland. Another example, in March 2023, Cyclone Freddy became the longest-lasting tropical cyclone on record. It started off from Australia's west coast, and it crossed the entire South Indian Ocean, traveling in total over 5,000 miles to strike Madagascar and Malawi, where it caused widespread damage. And with the longevity of 34 days, Cyclone Freddy was classified as both the longest lasting and highest energy producing tropical cyclone ever recorded. And there are two more points I want to make. Number one, that it still had so much energy that after it devastated parts of Malawi on the southeast coast of Africa, it turned around, picked up more energy from the hot, warm water, ocean waters, and turned again and devastated the same areas again. And the other point, which is again almost impossible to believe, but Cyclone Freddy was such a powerful cyclone that its own energy was the equivalent of an entire year of North Atlantic hurricanes. So a total force of North Atlantic hurricanes in any one year was the equivalent of one storm in the South Indian Ocean. So the next point, the Arctic ice cap is melting. Indeed, satellite-based images of the sea ice surrounding the North Pole have provided a reliable tool for continuously monitoring the changes in the Arctic since 1979. And this image shows the loss of ice in the last 25 years. Well, I went very close to that when I went through the Northwest Passage, and this is my track. My track, starting from Dutch Harbor and the Aleutians and then going through the Bering Strait, is the blue line. And it went all the way through the Northwest Passage, more or less a total of almost 5,000 miles, all the way to Nuuk in Greenland. And the yellow line is what the ice cap, the polar ice cap was like now working backwards about 50 years ago. Well, here it is actually. I managed to actually see the ice cap. We're sailing about 75 degrees north on the start of our transit of the Northwest Passage. And just behind my crew, you can see that is from there all the way 900 miles to the North Pole is just ice. We did quite a bit of sailing off various glaciers while in the Northwest Passage, because that's another phenomenon highlighted by the fact that the oceans are getting warmer. This one is still quite okay. The glacier hasn't suffered too much, but on the other hand, this is a glacier in the same valley or bay where the existing glacier has already retreated and it's almost disappeared. And this is one which I photographed in Norway, and which again it sees that not just the Arctic, but even in Norway, the glaciers are seriously retreating. The same situation on a different level happens in Antarctica. The ice shelf surrounding Antarctica is diminishing, and the impact of this climate crisis on melting the sea ice in Antarctic has been recorded since 1981. So we have more or less 40 years now of record. And the contraction of the Antarctic sea ice in recent years indicates that the current record level of heat in the oceans will eventually result in a 4-meter rise in sea levels, which is unimaginable, and it could have terrible consequences for the future of humanity. Once again, I was very fortunate to sail with my boat, this is Aventura 3, making landfall off the Antarctic Peninsula, and that is the shelf that we're talking about here now, and which is diminishing at a very fast rate. And here I am anchored with Aventura 3. This used to be a glacier here. It's all the way you see its remains are in the background there. It's still a very low glacier. And this area was all covered by ice until about 10 or 15 years ago. And now it's just a small, very well-protected bay to anchor. The Gulf Stream rate is slowing down. And this is a very long explanation, but I want to let you take the time to read it properly, because climate scientists have detected the warning signs of the possible collapse of the Gulf Stream. there has been a considerable loss of stability in the system of currents that make up the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, AMOC. The currents are already at their slowest rate in over a millennium, and the new analysis concludes that they may be nearing a complete shutdown. Such an event would have catastrophic consequences around the world, severely disrupting rainfall, increasing storms, and rising sea levels. The AMOC is driven by dense salty water sinking into the North Atlantic Ocean, but the fresh water that is melting from Greenland's ice sheet is significantly slowing down the process. So data extracted from ice cores going back 100,000 years show that the AMOC has two states, a strong one and a slow, weak one. The complexity of the system makes it impossible to forecast the date of such a collapse, but the effects of climate warming could make it to switch abruptly between states in the following 1 to 5 decades. So it's very possible that before the end of this century, the Gulf Stream would have been really seriously affected by this change. An immediate consequence of the warming of the surface temperatures is also the change in the behavior of the jet streams, resulting in reversed atmospheric air pressure patterns and decreasing strength of trade winds. And this is the reason why I pointed out earlier that something is happening also as far as the trade winds are concerned. The source of energy of the jet stream is the temperature gradient between the subpolar and subtropical regions, caused by cold air descending from the Arctic, colliding with rising warm air from the tropics. Sorry, I just have to take a quick sip of water. So the trade winds are becoming less consistent, unfortunately for us. Still, the barefoot route going across the Pacific has seen already a diminishing in the consistency of the trade winds, and also the regular routes, the classic routes from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean. And this is another phenomenon of the inconsistency of the trade winds in areas where they used to be a constant and reliable feature. As the polar regions are getting warmer at a faster rate than the low latitudes due to global warming, the polar temperature gradient is weakening and thereby affects both the strength and consistency of trade winds. It's more or less what I also mentioned when I described the situation as far as the jet stream is concerned. Finally, the tropical storm seasons are less clearly defined and becoming more active. And this is the reason why in the atlas, the page I showed you earlier, we decided not to take the data from the last 25 years, which was taken for the entire atlas, for the pilot charts, which I'm going to describe and discuss in part 2 of this presentation. But we only took with Ivan the last 12 years to record all the tracks of the hurricanes and then to define the areas which are now regarded as critical. A very powerful hurricane occurred in August 2023, Hurricane Dora, which passed south of the Hawaiian Islands. Again, a steep pressure gradient between Dora and the strong anticyclone north of Hawaii produced extremely strong winds, causing multiple wildfires in Hawaii. The most devastating occurred on the island of Maui, where over 100 people were killed. Dora logged more hours as a Category 4 hurricane than any other storm in the Pacific for over 50 years. Another relatively recent phenomenon is the tendency of hurricanes to cyclones to cross the continental landmass between the two oceans, which was very rare and is still quite rare, because normally as a tropical storm hits the landmass and the cooler environment, it drops its energy and it ceases to be a hurricane or a cyclone or a typhoon. Well, this is not happening anymore. They have so much energy in them that they can't cross, like this Bonnie that crossed the Isthmus of Panama and then reached the Northeast Pacific. So a recent example is that this hurricane, which formed off the African coast in 22 in June and passed over the Eastern Caribbean before reaching the Pacific. A similar situation happened in the Western Pacific when Typhoon Pablo originated in the South China Sea and initially passed over Vietnam before reaching Thailand, as you can see on the chart. It continued west into the North Indian Ocean and made landfall in the Bay of Bengal. And what is very interesting and worrying in some ways is that it happened in January, and that we used to be considered the safest time and the best time to start a passage and the voyage from Southeast Asia to the Red Sea. It's not a route that is so much sailed nowadays. Most of the boats around the world voyage would sail around the Cape of Good Hope. But in any case, 20, 30 years ago, this was considered to be the safe season in the Bay of Bengal and Southeast Asia. Well, no longer, if typhoons start crossing the landmass from the Pacific into the Indian Ocean. Also, extra-seasonal tropical storms are more common. So these are tropical storms that are described as tropical storms, but do not occur during the accepted seasons, but outside of those seasons. South Pacific is one of the areas where such cyclones are occurring more regularly, and the incidence of extra-seasonal cyclones in the Coral Sea has also increased, with cyclones having been recorded as late as June, July, and September. And remember, the safe season is considered to be from about June, from November to June. And during the summer, these are the months of winter, which are normally safe, considered to be safe, June, July, and September. But this is no longer the case. And these are all months in the accepted safe season. So every one of these facts is having a direct or indirect effect on offshore sailing. As a result, the safety factor in voyage planning has become even more important than in the past, and even much more important. And that's the whole point of this presentation. So, bearing in mind the changed circumstances, these are the basic safety measures that should be adhered to when planning a voyage now or in the near future. Ensure that you do not arrive in the tropics too close to the start of the safe season and allow a safe margin by leaving before its end. Avoid cruising during the critical period and preferably leave the tropics. At all times, monitor the weather and have a plan B to deploy in case of an emergency. And if you plan to leave the boat unattended, make sure your insurance company is informed and agrees with your plans, because they may not agree because they suffered too many claims on boats that were left behind in the tropical area, which was affected by tropical storms. So that's why this last point is very important, to consult your insurance company whether they are prepared to insure the boat, even if it's left in a boatyard which is well protected, but you have to have that in writing. So we come now to the end of this presentation, this part one. I want to apologize if I gave a lot of bad news, but I wanted to get rid of the bad news in the early part, because in the part 2, 3, and 4, I promise you I will describe the voyage, whether just across the ocean or all the way around the world, that can still be, and this is the positive and optimistic note, that can still be planned and undertaken under safe conditions. So we're going to talk next time about forward planning and how to plan around the world voyage by taking advantage of the most favorable sailing conditions and avoiding critical areas and seasons. That is the subject which we're going to cover next time. And this would be the area which I want to describe. It's shown the whole voyage around the world, around the Cape of Good Hope and all the way around, possibly with 3 starts, one from Europe, one from the east coast of the United States, and was from the west coast of the United States. And also I will have to introduce to some of you who are not aware of it or not planning to use pilot charts, which I describe as a navigator's best friend. Well, I still want to tell you that planning a long-term voyage, something that will happen in 6 months or in a year's time and so on, with grip files and with today's forecast, is impossible. You need to have some tools that show you the kind of weather conditions, tropical storms, the kind of winds, trade winds or no, currents and so on, that show you the conditions for every month of the year for every ocean in the world. And this is the purpose of the Ocean Atlas, which Ivan and I produced. And I'm going to describe that atlas itself and why it is such a useful tool in the next presentation.